Catherine, Natasha, thanks for all your kind words and your stories and stuff. You made my kid's dad, their papa, look good.
At 45, a memory from 1990 still sits heavy in Macaulay Culkin's mind. Not as a fun story from a famous movie set, but as something far more complicated and far more personal. It starts with a question that lingers. How can a childhood moment that looks heartwarming on screen turn into something that quietly shapes a fear for decades? And what happens when the person playing a mother in front of millions becomes tied to a feeling a child never fully understood? For years, that memory stayed buried. It wasn't forgotten. It was simply too difficult to explain without it sounding wrong.
You're not only the best woman I've ever known, you're the best person I've ever known. And after the birth of our two boys, you become one of my three favorite people. You're somewhere in there.
Then, on the morning of January 30th, 2026, the news broke that CatherineOHara had died. Suddenly, the silence around that moment felt impossible to maintain. The story goes back to February 1990 in Chicago, on the set of Home Alone. It was still dark when cars pulled into the warehouse lot. Snow covered the roads. Inside, the mood was tense. The film had gone over budget. The schedule was stretched thin. Everyone felt the pressure. At the center of it stood a 9-year-old boy under hot lights, surrounded by quiet adults and heavy expectations. The scene required real emotion, fear, panic, distress. The camera moved in. The room fell silent. Adult mouths moved, but the air felt thick and distant. There was an awareness that if this moment didn't work, the day would stall, the production would suffer, and somehow, the weight of that responsibility landed on a child's shoulders. He didn't cry. He froze. The silence felt louder than shouting. Eyes watched. Time slowed. And in that moment, something settled in that no child should ever feel. The sense of being a burden. Then CatherineOHara stepped forward without being asked. She walked through the lights and gently placed herself between the camera and the child. She bent down, met his eyes, and asked softly, "Can you hear them?" When he shook his head, she whispered, "Good. Don't listen." The set stopped. No one objected. No one interrupted. Everything paused around them, and for the first time that morning, the tears came, not as part of a performance, but as a release from real fear. Filming resumed. The moment passed. No one talked about it. Nothing was documented. But something had changed. From that day on, the presence of CatherineOHara brought a strange mix of comfort and unease. Safety seemed to exist only when she was nearby. Without realizing it, a child began scanning every room for her, tracking where she stood, watching whether she was close. No one stepped in to explain the difference between a character and real life. No one corrected the emotional confusion taking shape in silence. And slowly, without words, a belief formed that the feeling of protection was tied to someone who had never meant to carry that role beyond the screen. Once that February morning passed, something shifted that no one on set seemed to notice, except Macaulay Culkin. CatherineOHara was no longer just the actress who had stepped in to block the lights during a stressful scene. In a quiet, unspoken way, she became the only barrier between a child and a world ruled by shouted directions, countdown clocks, and watchful adult eyes. When she was nearby, he could breathe. When she stepped out of frame, he had to brace himself. As Home Alone moved into its final stretch of filming, each day felt tighter, more demanding than the last. Comedy scenes needed perfect timing. Emotional scenes needed depth. For a 9-year-old, the only real stability came from repetition, and Catherine became part of that routine. She didn't have to speak. She simply stood where he could see her, and that was enough. No one ever named what was happening. On camera, she was the actress playing his mother. Off camera, she was still just CatherineOHara, a kind adult in a system that had little time for gentleness. But in a child's mind, those two roles began to blur. No one paused to draw a line between them. No one stepped in to explain that comfort on a film set isn't meant to follow you home. There were days when he noticed her across the warehouse talking with the director, and he found himself counting the minutes until she returned to her usual place. If she left early, his chest tightened with a feeling he didn't yet understand. He didn't call it fear, he called it emptiness. That's the part that stayed invisible. Catherine never encouraged that dependence. She never made promises or pulled him closer, but she also never pushed the boundary away, and in an environment where everything has a clear start and finish, that gray space quietly grew. One afternoon, filming paused for a technical issue. Crew members scattered. Culkin sat alone on the fake front steps of the set. Catherine walked by, stopped, and asked if he was okay. He nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining. She sat beside him in silence. No pressure, no direction, just presence. For a child, that kind of quiet felt like safety. What a child can't understand is that presence doesn't always mean permanence. As filming wrapped, there was no ritual goodbye, no conversation about endings. Then one morning, she simply wasn't there. No warning, no explanation beyond a casual note that she had another commitment. He nodded, like always. But something inside felt like a wall had been removed without notice. That was the first time he remembers asking himself a question he couldn't yet put into words. If safety depends on someone who doesn't belong to your real life, what happens when they leave? The greatest losses rarely arrive with noise. They arrive in silence. In March 1990, Chicago was beginning to thaw, and the Home Alone set had shifted into teardown mode. Cables were pulled, lights came down, crew members moved with the tired momentum of a production reaching its end. Macaulay Culkin arrived like he always did. Same car, same routine, same waiting chair. Out of habit, his eyes searched for CatherineOHara before anyone else. She wasn't there. There was no empty chair marked for her. No message. No one stepped forward to explain. At first, it felt temporary. Maybe she was talking with the director in another corner. Maybe she would step into place once filming started, like always. But the lights came on. Action was called. Scenes began, and Catherine still didn't appear. He didn't panic. He had learned to stay calm, to follow direction, to say his lines. The scene was completed, but inside, something dropped fast, like a rope had been cut before he even realized he had been holding onto it. At lunch, he quietly asked a crew member where she was. The answer was casual. She had another commitment. He nodded, the way he had learned to nod in this world. Back in the makeup chair, staring into the mirror, the realization settled in. His sense of safety was no longer within sight. From that day forward, small changes began stacking up. He slept less. He flinched when light snapped on too quickly. He paid close attention to how adults spoke to him and adjusted himself to match their tone. On paper, he was still the cooperative child. Inside, he was slowly losing the ability to tell the difference between real safety and temporary comfort. During one afternoon scene, the director asked him to push the emotion further. He did. Not because he understood the character better, but because he had learned to use his own fear to get the result. When Catherine had been there, that fear felt contained. Without her, it became fuel. That night in a hotel room humming with heat, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. He wondered if she would come back and everything would return to normal. Then a harder question surfaced. What if she didn't? She didn't. There was no goodbye, no closing moment. Work simply continued. The set was dismantled piece by piece, the house reduced to wood and dust. No ritual marked the end. No one said, "This is over and you'll be okay." He told himself she had only been part of a movie, but his body didn't believe it. And that quiet loss became something that followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The real tragedy, Macaulay Culkin suggests, isn't CatherineOHara herself. It's the day she stepped out of frame and no one helped a child understand how to close that moment. From then on, he learned how to function without feeling truly safe. He learned to work through tension and call it normal. And when safety disappears without being acknowledged, it doesn't fade away, it changes shape. It follows quietly into adulthood like a shadow. By the early 2000s, that shadow had grown heavy. Public stories focused on addiction, money, and the cost of early fame, but none of them touched what he felt when he closed his eyes at night. An old emptiness that had first opened when he was 9 years old. He began stepping away from Hollywood, not because work wasn't available, but because he no longer knew how to show up as a whole person. Interviews felt like performances. Questions pulled him back toward a version of himself he no longer recognized but couldn't fully escape. In 2004, his health declined sharply. Photos circulated. Headlines used words like concerning. He avoided reading them, but he noticed how people looked at him, with worry, sometimes fear. And when people start to see you that way, disappearing feels easier than explaining. Then, one late afternoon, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, familiar, unmistakable. "This is Catherine." For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. Nearly 2 decades had passed since Chicago, since Home Alone, since the day she vanished from the set without a goodbye. And now she was calling, not as an on-screen mother, not as a symbol, but as someone reaching out directly. Her first question was simple. "You're still there, aren't you?" They met weeks later in a quiet New York cafe. No lights, no crew, no cameras. He arrived early and chose a seat with his back to the wall, a habit formed over years. When she walked in, he recognized something instantly, not from the screen, but from the way she slowed her pace, as if careful not to startle him. "You look tired," she said. "No judgment, just observation." He replied with a familiar automatic, "I'm okay." She held his gaze and answered gently, "No, you're not, but you're still here." They didn't talk about the past right away. She asked about sleep, food, daily routines, simple questions that anchored him to the present. At one point, he asked what he had carried for years. Did she know what would happen to him after she left that set in 1990? She paused for a long time before answering honestly. No. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't defensive. It was simply the truth, and for him, that honesty mattered more than anything else. During that meeting in New York, CatherineOHara said something Macaulay Culkin would carry for years. "You don't need to go back. You just need to keep going." For him, that sentence quietly closed a circle that had started in Chicago in 1990. Back then, she had stepped in and said, "Don't listen." Now she offered something just as simple. "I'm still here." Not to rewrite the past, not to take responsibility for it, but to gently fill a space that had once been left open. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was steady. After 2004, as Culkin slowly pulled himself out of the most difficult period of his life, the connection between them changed shape. It no longer felt tense or fragile. It became something calm, almost rhythmic. They didn't speak every day, they didn't need to. What mattered was knowing the line of communication was always there. Catherine lived the way she always had. Family first, work second, everything else carefully balanced. She was married to Bo Welch, focused on her home life, selective about the projects she accepted. She didn't chase appearances or headlines. She chose roles that fit the pace she wanted to keep. When they met in person, it was rarely anywhere public. Usually a quiet cafe during off hours or a short walk where conversation didn't need to go anywhere important. She asked simple questions: how he was sleeping, how he was eating, whether he was taking care of himself. Then she would talk about her sons, a script she was reading, or a project she had turned down because it didn't match her rhythm. Through that quiet consistency, he began learning something new: how to stay present without clinging. Between 2019 and 2020, as the world slowed down, their calls became shorter but more regular. She asked about routine. He asked about her health. When questions went too far, she gently shifted the topic. It wasn't avoidance, it was boundary. Then small signs began to appear. She ended calls early, saying she needed to rest. She chose quieter meeting spots. She left conversations before fatigue could set in. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments that slowly added up. One evening after a medical visit, she sent a short message. "I'm okay. Keep your rhythm." The words felt familiar, like something from years earlier, a reminder not to lose balance. This time, though, he understood that the rhythm she spoke about wasn't only for him, it was for her too.